My name is Jeanette, and at 57 years old, I thought I'd seen all the heartbreak life could offer. Standing in my kitchen this morning, looking out at the vast Texas pasture that stretches beyond my window, I can still feel the sting of that slap 5 years ago, the slap that cost me my only son. Today is my husband Robert's funeral, and I have this strange feeling that something is about to change everything. The silence in this house feels different somehow, like the calm before a storm that's been brewing for half a decade. Before I share what happened that changed everything, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories. You won't believe what my son demanded when he walked through that door. 27 years ago, when I first met Robert at a church social in small town Texas, I never imagined the life we'd build together. I was 25 working as a secretary at the local bank, and he was this gentle giant of a man who owned Sunset Ridge Ranch. 3,000 acres of rolling hills and grazing land that his grandfather had bought back in 1920. Robert courted me, the old-fashioned way. Sunday drives, church picnics, and long walks around his property where he'd point out every fence post and water well like they were precious treasures. When he proposed 2 years later, kneeling right there in the middle of his favorite pasture with his grandmother's ring, I knew I was saying yes to more than just marriage. I was saying yes to a way of life, to becoming part of something bigger than myself. Our son Marcus came along when I was 30. From the moment I held that 8-pound baby boy, I knew he was going to be the center of our world. Robert would carry him around the ranch in a little baby carrier, showing him the cattle and explaining how everything worked, even though Marcus couldn't understand a word. Those were the golden years, watching our boy grow up with dirt under his fingernails and the sun on his face. For 15 years, our life followed a beautiful rhythm. Dawn came early, with the sound of Robert's boots on the kitchen floor and the smell of coffee brewing. Marcus would stumble down in his pajamas, hair sticking up every direction, ready for whatever adventure the day might bring. Weekends meant riding horses along the creek bed, checking on newborn calves, and teaching Marcus how to mend fences and read the weather. I remember one particular summer evening when Marcus was about 12. We were sitting on the front porch after dinner watching the fireflies dance across the pasture. Robert had his arm around me, and Marcus was sprawled on the porch swing, his head in my lap while I ran my fingers through his hair. He looked up at me with those bright blue eyes, so much like his father's, and said, "Mama, I'm going to take care of this place forever, just like Daddy does." My heart nearly burst with pride that night, but even then, there were signs I chose to ignore. Marcus had always been strong-willed, the kind of child who questioned everything and wanted to do things his own way. When he was 8, he refused to help with the chickens because he said it was boring. When he turned 13, he started complaining about getting up early for chores, saying his friends in town got to sleep in on weekends. Still, Robert and I worked hard to give Marcus every opportunity we never had. We saved every penny we could spare, sometimes going without things ourselves, so Marcus could have the best education possible. When he graduated valedictorian from our small high school, we were bursting with pride. The local newspaper even ran a story about the ranch boy who was headed to the University of Texas on a partial scholarship. The night before Marcus left for college, Robert and I stayed up late talking about our dreams for him. We imagined him coming back with new ideas to improve the ranch, maybe even expanding into different areas of agriculture. Robert had this vision of Marcus bringing fresh thinking to old traditions, making Sunset Ridge even more successful than it had been for 3 generations. Marcus excelled in college just like we knew he would. He majored in business administration and called home every Sunday night for the first 2 years, full of stories about his classes, his professors, and the big city life in Austin. But somewhere during his junior year, those calls started getting shorter and less frequent. When he did call, he sounded different somehow. More impatient, less interested in hearing about the everyday happenings on the ranch. After graduation, Marcus landed a job with a commercial real estate firm in Dallas. The starting salary was more money than Robert and I had ever seen in a single year, and Marcus made sure we knew it. His apartment was in one of those fancy high-rise buildings downtown, and when we visited for the first time, I felt so out of place in my simple dress and practical shoes. That's when we met Stephanie. She was everything I wasn't. Tall, thin, perfectly styled blonde hair, and clothes that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She worked in marketing for some big corporation and spoke in terms I didn't understand about brands and demographics and market positioning. When Marcus introduced us, she looked me up and down with this little smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "Oh, you're the rancher folks. How quaint." I tried to give Stephanie the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was just nervous about meeting Marcus's parents. But over the next several months, it became clear that she had very definite opinions about our way of life. During family dinners, she'd make comments about how inefficient small scale ranching was, how the land could be better utilized for development, and how Marcus was wasting his potential by maintaining ties to such an outdated industry. The real trouble started when Marcus began echoing her opinions. During one particularly tense Christmas dinner, he announced that small family ranches were economically unsustainable and that we should consider maximizing our asset value by selling to developers. Robert's face went red and his hands shook as he set down his fork. "Son," Robert said in that quiet, controlled voice he used when he was really upset, "this land has been in our family for 3 generations. Your great-grandfather cleared these fields by hand. Your grandfather built that barn with his own 2 hands during the Depression. This isn't just property, it's our heritage." Marcus rolled his eyes and launched into some speech about how emotional attachment to land was preventing us from making smart financial decisions. Stephanie nodded along, adding her own commentary about sunk cost fallacy and opportunity cost. I watched Robert's heart break a little more with every word. As months passed, Marcus's visits home became more and more stressful. He'd walk around the property with this critical eye pointing out everything that needed updating or repair, but never offering to help with the actual work. He'd make suggestions about selling portions of the land for development, bringing in corporate farming operations, or converting the place into some kind of agritourism business. Meanwhile, Robert was dealing with health problems he tried to hide from me. I'd catch him holding his chest sometimes or see him sitting down to rest more often than usual. When I asked if he was feeling okay, he'd just smile and say he was fine. But I knew better. The stress of watching our son drift away from everything we'd taught him was taking its toll on the man who'd worked this land for over 30 years. The breaking point came when Marcus started pressuring Robert to sign legal documents that would give him partial ownership of the ranch. He presented it as estate planning, but I could see through the fancy language to what it really was. Marcus wanted access to the land's value while Robert was still alive, and Stephanie was pushing him toward that goal with increasing urgency. The confrontation that changed everything happened on a Sunday afternoon in October. I remember the date exactly because it was October 15th, the same day Robert had proposed to me all those years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me later. Marcus showed up unannounced around 3 in the afternoon driving that expensive silver sedan that looked so out of place parked next to Robert's old pickup truck. He walked into our house without knocking, something he'd never done before, and I could immediately tell he was agitated about something. "We need to talk," he announced, not even bothering with pleasantries or asking how we were doing. Robert was sitting in his favorite recliner reading the Sunday paper and enjoying a rare moment of relaxation. He looked up over his reading glasses with that gentle expression he always wore when dealing with Marcus's moods. "What's on your mind, son?" Robert asked, setting aside his paper and giving Marcus his full attention. Marcus began pacing around our small living room like a caged animal. "Stephanie is pregnant," he said without any preamble. "We're getting married next month and we need to buy a house. A real house in a good neighborhood in Dallas, not some rural shack." My heart should have leaped with joy at the news of a grandchild, but something about the way Marcus delivered this information made my stomach clench with worry instead. There was no happiness in his announcement, no excitement about starting a family. It sounded more like he was presenting a business problem that needed solving. "That's wonderful news about the baby," I said carefully, trying to inject some warmth into the conversation. "When is Stephanie due? We'd love to help plan the wedding." Marcus waved his hand dismissively. "The wedding's going to be small, just immediate family. The point is we need money for a down payment, and we need it now. The housing market in Dallas is competitive, and we can't wait around for years." Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Well, son, you know we'd help if we could, but ranch income isn't exactly predictable. Maybe you could look into a smaller place to start or consider a longer engagement to save up more money." "That's not good enough," Marcus snapped, his voice rising. "I'm not asking for a loan, Dad. I'm asking for what's rightfully mine. This ranch is worth millions of dollars just in land value alone. You could sell half of it and still have more acres than you know what to do with." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Robert slowly rose from his chair, his face pale, but his jaw set in that determined way I had seen countless times over the years. "Marcus, Robert said quietly. Your mama and I have explained this before. This ranch isn't just a financial asset. It's our home, our livelihood, and our family's legacy. I'm not selling any part of it. Marcus threw his hands up in frustration. Legacy? What legacy? You're barely making ends meet out here. The cattle market is down. The equipment is falling apart and you're working yourself to death for what? So you can leave me a pile of debt and some sentimental attachment to dirt. That dirt, Robert said, his voice starting to shake with emotion, is what put you through college. That dirt is what put food on your table and clothes on your back for 18 years. That dirt is what built the character and work ethic that got you where you are today. I could see this conversation spiraling out of control, and I tried to step in before things got worse. Maybe we could all sit down and discuss this calmly, I suggested. There might be other options we haven't considered. Marcus, you have a good job. Maybe the bank would approve a loan based on your income. Marcus turned on me with an expression I'd never seen before. His face was twisted with anger and frustration, and for a moment I didn't recognize the little boy I'd raised. Stay out of this, Mom, he said coldly. This is between me and Dad. You don't understand anything about finance or business. You've never worked a real job in your life. The words hit me like a physical blow. I thought about all the years I'd worked alongside Robert managing the books, caring for sick animals at all hours of the night, cooking for hired hands during busy seasons, and countless other tasks that kept our operation running. But more than that, his tone was so dismissive, so disrespectful that it took my breath away. Don't you dare speak to your mother that way, Robert said, taking a step toward Marcus. She's worked harder than you've ever worked in your entire life. She deserves your respect, not your contempt. Respect? Marcus laughed bitterly. Respect for what? For living in the past, for refusing to see opportunities when they're right in front of you. You and Mom are stuck in some fantasy where this little ranch operation actually matters in the real world. That's when I found my voice again. Marcus, please, I said, reaching out to touch his arm. You're upset about the baby and the wedding, and I understand the pressure you're feeling, but this isn't the way to handle it. Your father and I love you, and we want to help, but we can't sacrifice everything we've built just because you want us to. Marcus jerked his arm away from my touch like I'd burned him. Love, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. If you loved me, you'd want me to succeed. If you loved me, you'd want your grandchild to grow up in a decent house instead of worrying about whether Grandpa's going to lose the farm. We're not going to lose the farm, Robert said firmly, and your child would be lucky to grow up with the values and experiences this place can provide. Values like settling for less, like being content with mediocrity, like watching opportunities pass by because you're too sentimental to make smart decisions. I felt tears starting to sting my eyes, but I tried one more time to reach my son. Marcus, honey, you're talking about our life's work like it's worthless. This ranch, this lifestyle, it's not just about money. It's about family, about tradition, about building something lasting. Marcus stepped closer to me, his face contorted with anger and frustration. You just don't get it, do you? None of this matters anymore. The world has moved on, and you're still playing house in the middle of nowhere. Please don't talk to us like that, I said softly. We're your parents. We love you, but what you're asking for isn't fair and it's not right. That's when it happened. Marcus raised his hand and slapped me across the face with a force that sent me stumbling backward. The sound echoed through our quiet living room like a gunshot, and for a moment all three of us stood frozen in shock at what had just occurred. My cheek burned where his hand had connected, and I could taste blood where my teeth had caught my lip. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional devastation of realizing that my own son, the baby I'd nursed and rocked and sung to sleep for countless nights, had just struck me in anger. Robert's face went completely white, and I thought for a moment he might collapse. He stood there staring at Marcus with an expression of such profound disappointment and heartbreak that it made my own pain seem small by comparison. Marcus seemed shocked by his own action, but instead of apologizing, he doubled down on his anger. I'm done with this family and this worthless dirt, he said, his voice shaking with rage. You two can rot out here for all I care. When you finally come to your senses and decide to join the real world, you know where to find me. With that, he stormed out of the house, slamming the door so hard that my grandmother's china rattled in the cabinet. Through the window, I watched him throw a suitcase into his car and speed down our gravel driveway without looking back. Robert and I stood in our living room listening to the sound of his engine fade into the distance, and I knew that something fundamental had just been broken in our family. The little boy who used to fall asleep in my lap while I read him stories was gone, replaced by a stranger who could raise his hand to his own mother without a second thought. The 5 years that followed were the longest and most difficult of my life. That first night after Marcus left, Robert held me while I cried until I had no tears left. We both kept expecting the phone to ring, expecting some kind of apology or attempt at reconciliation, but the silence stretched on for days, then weeks, then months. I must have picked up the phone to call Marcus 100 times during those first few weeks. I'd dial his number and listen to it ring, hoping to hear his voice, even if it was still angry. But he never answered my calls, and eventually his number was disconnected entirely. Robert tried to stay strong for both of us, but I could see the toll it was taking on him. He'd always been a man who solved problems through hard work and determination, but this wasn't the kind of problem that could be fixed by mending fences or treating sick cattle. His son had rejected everything he stood for, and there was nothing Robert could do to change that. The stress began affecting Robert's health in ways that became impossible to ignore. He started having chest pains more frequently, and I noticed him getting winded doing tasks that had never bothered him before. When I begged him to see a doctor, he'd just say he was getting older and needed to pace himself better. Through mutual friends and the small-town gossip network, I learned bits and pieces about Marcus's life. He had married Stephanie in a small ceremony at a Dallas hotel. None of our family had been invited, not even Robert's brother, who lived just 2 hours away. They bought a house in an expensive suburb, and Stephanie gave birth to a little boy they named Andrew. Knowing I had a grandson I'd never met was perhaps the cruelest part of the whole situation. I'd imagine what he might look like, whether he had Marcus's blue eyes or Stephanie's blonde hair. I wondered if he ever asked about his grandparents, or if Marcus had simply told him we didn't exist. Sometimes I'd catch Robert staring at an old photo of Marcus as a little boy, the one where he was sitting on his first pony with a huge grin on his face. Robert would just sit there with that picture in his hands, and I knew he was wondering where that happy little boy had gone and if they'd ever find their way back to each other. The ranch work continued because cattle don't care about family drama, but it became increasingly difficult with just the two of us and our hired hand Jimmy, who'd been working for us for over a decade. Robert pushed himself harder than ever, as if physical exhaustion could somehow dull the emotional pain he was carrying. During the 3rd year, Robert had his first serious heart attack. I found him collapsed in the barn one morning, barely conscious and struggling to breathe. The ambulance ride to the county hospital was the longest 30 minutes of my life, with Robert drifting in and out of consciousness while I held his hand and prayed harder than I'd ever prayed before. He recovered from that episode, but his doctor made it clear that his heart had been damaged and that he needed to drastically reduce his stress and physical activity. Robert nodded and agreed to all the doctor's recommendations, but I knew he was thinking about the ranch and wondering how we'd manage with his reduced capacity. That's when Robert decided to update his will. He'd had a simple will before leaving everything to me and Marcus equally, but after Marcus's behavior and his own health scare, Robert felt the need to make his intentions crystal clear. He spent hours with our family lawyer, Thomas Henderson, making sure every detail was properly documented. "Jeanette," Robert said to me after one of his meetings with Thomas, "I want you to know exactly what's in this will. The ranch, the house, all our bank accounts, everything goes to you." Marcus made his choice when he walked out of here, and I'm not rewarding that choice by giving him a piece of our life's work. I asked Robert if he was sure about cutting Marcus out entirely, and he just shook his head sadly. "I'm not cutting him out, honey. He cut himself out. If he ever comes back and makes things right, you can decide what to do with the property, but I won't give him a reward for abandoning his family and disrespecting his mother." The 4th year brought more health problems for Robert. He had another smaller heart attack in the fall, followed by a stroke that left him weak on his left side for several weeks. Each medical crisis made it clearer that our time together was limited, and I found myself grieving for my husband even while he was still alive. Through it all, there was no word from Marcus, no phone calls during Robert's hospital stays, no visits, no acknowledgement that his father was dying by inches while carrying the weight of their broken relationship. I wrote letters that I never sent, practicing words that might bring my son home before it was too late. Robert died on a Tuesday morning in April, just as the spring grass was starting to turn green across our pastures. He went peacefully in his sleep, which the doctor said was a blessing given the extent of his heart damage. I found him that morning when I brought his coffee to the bedroom, looking so calm and peaceful that for a moment I thought he was just sleeping deeply. The funeral arrangements felt surreal, like I was moving through a dream. Thomas Henderson helped me with the legal paperwork while I planned a service for the man who'd been my partner for over 30 years. The church was packed with friends, neighbors, and fellow ranchers who'd known Robert since childhood. Everyone had stories about his kindness, his integrity, and his love for the land. Throughout the entire service, I kept glancing toward the back of the church, hoping against hope that Marcus would walk through those doors. I imagined him slipping into the last pew, maybe keeping his distance, but at least showing up to say goodbye to his father. But the service ended, and we proceeded to the cemetery, and still there was no sign of my son. Standing beside Robert's grave as they lowered his casket into the ground, I felt more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. The man who'd been my rock, my best friend, and my partner in everything was gone, and the son I'd raised to carry on his legacy was nowhere to be found. The days following Robert's funeral passed in a blur of paperwork, condolence visits, and the strange quiet that settles over a house when half of its life has suddenly been removed. Friends brought casseroles and offered to help with ranch work, but mostly, I just wanted to be alone with my grief and my memories. Thomas Henderson had given me copies of all the legal documents I'd need, including Robert's will and the various property deeds that now had my name as the sole owner. The weight of responsibility felt overwhelming. This ranch that had been built and maintained by generations of Robert's family was now entirely in my hands, and I wasn't sure I was strong enough to carry that burden alone. 3 days after the funeral, I was sitting in Robert's chair in the living room, still wearing the black dress I'd worn to the service, because changing clothes felt like too much effort when I heard a car coming up the gravel drive. For just a moment, my heart leaped with the impossible hope that it might be Marcus finally coming home. Through the front window, I could see a silver sedan that looked familiar but different somehow. It was definitely Marcus's car, but it was cleaner and newer than I remembered. Behind the wheel, I could make out a figure that looked like my son but taller and more filled out than the angry young man who'd stormed out of this house 5 years earlier. The car parked in the same spot where Robert's old pickup used to sit, and I watched as Marcus got out of the driver's side. He was wearing a black suit that looked expensive and well-tailored, and his hair was shorter and styled in a way that made him look older and more serious. For a moment, he stood beside his car, looking at the house, and I wondered what thoughts were going through his mind. Then the passenger door opened and Stephanie emerged. She too was dressed in black, but her outfit looked more like something you'd wear to a business meeting than a family gathering. She moved around the car to stand beside Marcus, and I could see her saying something to him, though I couldn't hear the words through the window. That's when I noticed the back door opening and a small figure climbed out. My grandson. My heart nearly stopped as I got my first look at Andrew, who appeared to be about 4 years old. Even from a distance, I could see Robert's features in that little face. The same strong jawline, the same bright eyes, the same way of holding his head when he was curious about something. Andrew was looking around at the ranch with obvious interest, pointing at the barn and the pastures where our cattle were grazing in the distance. I could see him asking questions, and Marcus was answering with what looked like impatience rather than enthusiasm. Stephanie kept checking her phone and looking like she wanted to be anywhere else. I forced myself to get up from Robert's chair and walk to the front door. My legs felt shaky, and my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I opened the door just as Marcus was walking up the front steps, and for the first time in 5 years, I was looking into the face of my son. He looked good, healthy, and successful, but there was a hardness around his eyes that hadn't been there before. His face was clean-shaven, and his posture was confident, but when our eyes met, I didn't see any warmth or recognition of the pain our separation had caused. "Marcus," I said, my voice coming out as barely more than a whisper. "I heard about Dad," he said simply, without any greeting or acknowledgement of the years that had passed between us. Stephanie approached the porch carrying Andrew, who was staring at me with undisguised curiosity. "You must be Jeanette," she said with that same polite smile I remembered from years before. "I'm sorry for your loss." But it was Andrew who broke my heart and filled it at the same time. He looked at me with those familiar blue eyes and asked in a clear, sweet voice, "Are you my grandma?" Before I could answer, Marcus shifted uncomfortably and said, "We can't stay long. We need to talk about Dad's affairs and get back to Dallas tonight." I wanted to scoop up my grandson and hold him close to ask him about his favorite toys and his friends at school to make up for 4 years of missing birthdays and Christmas mornings. But something in Marcus's posture told me that wasn't going to be allowed. "Come inside," I said, stepping back from the doorway. "Please." As they walked into the living room where Robert and I had spent so many quiet evenings together, I could see Marcus looking around with an appraising eye. He was taking inventory, I realized, calculating the value of everything he could see. Andrew immediately gravitated toward an old wooden toy box in the corner, the same one that had held Marcus's toys when he was little. "Can I play with these?" he asked, looking up at Stephanie for permission. "Don't touch anything," Stephanie said sharply. "We're not here to play." I knelt down to Andrew's level, ignoring Stephanie's disapproving look. "Those toys belonged to your daddy when he was your age," I told him gently. "Would you like to see them?" Andrew's face lit up with excitement, but before he could answer, Marcus interrupted. "We're not here for a social visit," he said coldly. "We need to talk about Dad's will and how we're going to handle the property division." The conversation that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Marcus sat down on our old sofa like he owned the place, while Stephanie remained standing near the window, occasionally checking her phone and looking bored. Andrew had found an old wooden horse in the toy box and was quietly playing on the floor, providing the only pleasant sound in an increasingly tense room. "I assume Dad left the ranch to both of us," Marcus said without any preamble. "We'll need to get it appraised and figure out the best way to liquidate the assets. The cattle market might be soft right now, but the land value should more than make up for it." I stared at my son, amazed by his assumption that he would inherit anything after 5 years of complete silence. "Marcus," I said carefully, "your father's will is very specific about his intentions." "Of course it is," Marcus replied confidently. "He was always thorough about paperwork. I'm assuming he set up some kind of trust or partnership arrangement to minimize the tax burden when the property transfers." Stephanie finally looked up from her phone. "We've already spoken to a real estate developer who's interested in the southern section," she added. "Apparently there's demand for residential development in this area, and the access to the main highway makes it very attractive." I felt a cold anger building in my chest. They hadn't been here for 10 minutes, and they were already making plans to carve up the land that Robert had loved more than his own life. "No one is developing any part of this ranch," I said firmly. Marcus gave me that condescending look I remembered from his teenage years. "Mom, I understand this is emotional for you, but we need to be practical. Keeping a cattle operation this size running profitably requires more capital investment than it's worth. The smart thing to do is sell while the market is good and invest the money in something with better returns." "Better returns?" I repeated, my voice rising slightly. "Marcus, this isn't just an investment. This is our family's legacy. This is where you learned to ride a horse, where you caught your first fish, where you built that treehouse with your father when you were 10 years old." Marcus waved his hand dismissively. "Sentimental value doesn't pay bills, Mom. Dad might have been content to struggle along out here, but I have a family to think about. Andrew deserves better opportunities than what this place can provide." I looked down at my grandson, who was still playing quietly with the wooden horse. "What opportunities?" I asked. "The opportunity to learn about hard work and responsibility. The opportunity to understand where food comes from and how to care for animals. The opportunity to grow up with space to run and explore instead of being locked up in some suburban subdivision." Stephanie laughed a sharp sound that had no warmth in it. "Those are very romantic ideas, Jeanette, but they're not realistic in today's world. Children need technology, educational resources, cultural experiences. They need to be prepared for careers that actually matter in the modern economy." "And what career is more important than feeding people?" I asked, looking directly at her. "What's more valuable than taking care of the land and the animals that sustain life?" Marcus stood up and began pacing around the room, just like he had 5 years earlier during that terrible argument with Robert. "This is exactly the kind of thinking that's holding back rural communities," he said. "You're so attached to the past that you can't see the possibilities for the future." I watched my son pace and noticed how much he'd changed. The boy who used to love helping with the morning chores, who used to beg to stay up late during calving season, who used to talk about raising horses someday, was completely gone. In his place was a stranger who saw dollar signs where I saw memories, who saw inefficiency where I saw tradition. "Marcus," I said quietly, "do you remember when you were 12 and that storm knocked down the big oak tree by the creek?" He stopped pacing and looked at me with irritation. "What does that have to do with anything?" "You cried when you saw that tree down," I continued. "You said it wasn't fair because that tree had been there longer than any of us and it deserved to keep growing. Your father and I were so proud of you that day because we thought you understood what it means to respect things that are bigger and older and more important than our immediate wants." Marcus's face hardened. "I was 12, Mom. I grew up. I learned that progress sometimes requires difficult decisions." "You learned that money matters more than meaning," I said sadly. "Money is what puts food on the table and pays for Andrew's education and keeps a roof over our heads," Stephanie interjected. "Meaning doesn't pay the mortgage." I looked at this woman who had married my son and helped turn him into someone I barely recognized. There are different kinds of wealth, Stephanie. There's the kind you can put in a bank account, and there's the kind that enriches your soul. Robert and I always felt rich because we had meaningful work, a beautiful place to live, and the satisfaction of building something lasting. "Well, that's a very nice philosophy," Marcus said sarcastically. "But it doesn't change the fact that we need to settle Dad's estate and move forward with our lives. I've got a good job, but the cost of living in Dallas keeps going up, and we're planning to have another child soon. I need my inheritance to secure my family's future." The word inheritance hit me like a slap. Marcus was talking about his father's life's work like it was a lottery ticket he'd been waiting to cash in. "Your inheritance," I repeated slowly. "Yes," Marcus said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Half of everything Dad owned. The land, the house, the equipment, the livestock. It's my right as his son." "You're right," I said, feeling that cold anger building again. "Tell me, Marcus, what exactly gives you the right to inherit anything from a man you didn't speak to for 5 years? What gives you the right to profit from a lifetime of work you rejected and criticized?" Marcus's face flushed red. "He was my father. That gives me the right. And in case you've forgotten, I'm his only child. Under Texas law, children have inheritance rights regardless of personal disagreements." "Personal disagreements?" I stood up, my hands shaking with emotion. "Is that what you call abandoning your family? Is that what you call striking your own mother and walking away without ever looking back?" Stephanie stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "Maybe we should all calm down and focus on the legal realities here. Emotional arguments aren't going to change what's in the will." I looked at both of them. These two people who had shown up at my husband's funeral, not to comfort me or pay their respects, but to claim their share of assets they'd never appreciated or understood. And then I did something that seemed to surprise all of us. I smiled. "You know what, Marcus?" I said, my voice becoming calm and steady. "You're absolutely right." Marcus blinked clearly, not expecting this response. "I'm right." "Yes," I continued, still smiling. "You're right that your father left you something in his will. In fact, he was very specific about what he wanted you to have." Marcus and Stephanie exchanged glances, and I could see the greed sparking in their eyes. Andrew looked up from his toys, sensing the change in atmosphere, even though he couldn't understand what was happening. "I'm glad you finally see reason," Marcus said, his voice taking on a more conciliatory tone. "I know this is hard for you, but it's the practical thing to do." "Oh, it's definitely the practical thing," I agreed. "In fact, your father was very practical when he made his final decisions about his estate." Just then, as if summoned by some divine sense of timing, I heard a car pulling into the driveway. Through the window, I could see Thomas Henderson's familiar blue sedan parking beside Marcus's silver car. "Perfect timing," I said, my smile growing wider. "Our lawyer is here. Now you can learn exactly what your father wanted you to have." Thomas Henderson had been Robert's friend since childhood and our family lawyer for over 20 years. He was a tall, thin man in his 60s with kind eyes and a gentle manner, but I knew that behind his soft-spoken demeanor was a sharp legal mind that had served our community well for decades. I watched Marcus and Stephanie straighten up as Thomas walked into our living room carrying his worn leather briefcase. Marcus immediately assumed the confident posture of a successful businessman dealing with legal formalities, while Stephanie smoothed her skirt and put on her most professional smile. "Thomas," I said, giving him a hug of genuine affection. "Thank you for coming so quickly." "Of course, Jeanette," he replied, his voice gentle but serious. "I'm sorry for your loss. Robert was a good man, and he'll be missed by everyone who knew him." Marcus stepped forward, extending his hand for a businesslike handshake. "Mr. Henderson, I'm Marcus. I believe you have some documents for us to review." Thomas shook Marcus's hand politely, but I could see him taking in the expensive suit, the impatient posture, and the calculating look in Marcus's eyes. Thomas had known Marcus as a boy, and I wondered what he was thinking about the man that boy had become. Yes, Thomas said simply. I have Robert's will with me, and I think it would be best if we review it together so there are no misunderstandings about his intentions. Stephanie moved closer to Marcus, and I could see her practically vibrating with anticipation. Andrew had abandoned his toys and was now sitting quietly in the corner, apparently sensing that something important was happening. Thomas opened his briefcase and removed a thick document bound in blue legal backing. Robert updated this will approximately 18 months ago, he said, looking directly at Marcus. He was very specific about his wishes, and he asked me to make sure they were clearly documented and legally sound. That's good, Marcus said, his voice betraying his eagerness despite his attempt to sound businesslike. I'm sure he wanted to make sure the estate transfer would be as smooth as possible. Thomas adjusted his reading glasses and opened the document. Let me start with the primary bequests, he said in his careful lawyer's voice. To my beloved wife, Jeanette Marie, I leave the entirety of my estate, including but not limited to the Sunset Ridge Ranch property consisting of 3,000 acres, the family residence, and all buildings thereon, all livestock equipment, vehicles, bank accounts, investments, and personal property. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the old clock ticking on the mantelpiece. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions from confusion to disbelief to growing anger. Wait, Marcus said, his voice tight. Read that again. Thomas repeated the words exactly, his tone remaining professional and neutral. Marcus stared at him as if the lawyer had just spoken in a foreign language. That can't be right, Stephanie said, her voice sharp with disbelief. There must be some mistake. Children have legal rights to inherit from their parents. Thomas looked at her over his glasses. In Texas, parents have the right to disinherit their children as long as the will is properly executed and witnessed, which this one was. Adult children have no automatic inheritance rights unless they're specifically provided for in the will. Marcus's face was getting redder by the minute. So I get nothing. After everything our family built, after all the years I put into this place growing up, I get nothing. That's not exactly true, Thomas said quietly. Robert did leave you something specific. I watched as hope flickered back into Marcus's eyes. Even Stephanie seemed to perk up, probably thinking there was some separate bequest that hadn't been mentioned yet. Thomas reached into his briefcase again and pulled out an envelope with Marcus's name written on it in Robert's careful handwriting. Your father asked me to give this to you personally. Marcus practically snatched the envelope from Thomas's hands, tearing it open with shaking fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in Robert's neat script. I watched my son's face as he read, seeing his expression change from hopeful to devastated to angry again. What does it say? Stephanie demanded, trying to read over Marcus's shoulder. Marcus's hands were trembling as he read aloud, his voice breaking slightly on some of the words. Son, I always loved you, but love doesn't mean enabling disrespect. You chose to leave our family the day you raised your hand to your mother. A real man protects women, especially his mother. When you learn to respect others, especially those who sacrificed for you, then you'll understand what inheritance truly means. It's not about money or land. It's about values, character, and family bonds. I pray someday you'll come home not for money, but to ask forgiveness and rebuild what was broken. The door is always open, but the inheritance was earned by love and lost by choice. By the time Marcus finished reading, there were tears in his eyes, but they seemed to be tears of rage rather than remorse. He crumpled the letter in his fist and threw it on the floor. This is insane, he said, his voice rising to almost a shout. He can't do this. I'm his son. I have rights. Thomas's voice remained calm and professional. As I explained, the will is legally valid. Your father was of sound mind when he executed it, and his instructions are clear and unambiguous. Stephanie had gone pale, but her eyes were flashing with anger. This is obviously the result of undue influence, she said, pointing an accusing finger at me. She manipulated a sick old man into cutting out his own son. I felt a flash of rage at her words, but Thomas spoke before I could respond. Mrs. I'm sorry, I don't believe I got your last name. Garrett, Stephanie said through gritted teeth. I'm Marcus's wife. Mrs. Garrett, Thomas continued smoothly. I can assure you that Robert made these decisions entirely on his own. In fact, he specifically asked me to document his mental state and his reasoning at the time he updated the will precisely to prevent any claims of undue influence. Marcus began pacing again, running his hands through his hair. There has to be something we can do. We can contest it. We can argue that he wasn't mentally competent. You're welcome to try, Thomas said mildly. But I should warn you that contesting a will in Texas is expensive and difficult, especially when the deceased worked with competent legal counsel and followed all proper procedures. You'd need to prove either that Robert lacked mental capacity or that he was coerced, and I have extensive documentation showing that neither of those things occurred. Stephanie pulled out her phone and started frantically typing. I'm calling our lawyer in Dallas, she announced. There has to be something we can do about this. Andrew, who had been sitting quietly through this whole exchange, suddenly spoke up in his clear little voice. Daddy, why are you so mad? The question seemed to cut through Marcus's anger for just a moment, and I saw him look down at his son with something that might have been shame. But then his face hardened again, and he turned that cold stare back to me. You did this? He said accusingly. You poisoned him against me. You made him think I was some kind of monster just because I wanted to help our family succeed. I felt my own anger finally breaking through the calm facade I'd been maintaining. I didn't have to poison anyone against anything, Marcus. Your father watched you reject everything he'd spent his life building. He watched you treat this ranch and our way of life like it was worthless. He watched you disrespect me in his own home and then disappear for 5 years without a word. I was building my own life, Marcus shouted. I was trying to create something better for my family. By abandoning your existing family, I shot back. By striking your mother and walking away, by never calling, never visiting, never showing up when your father was in the hospital or when he was dying. Stephanie stepped between us, her face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous, she announced. Marcus doesn't owe you anything just because you chose to live like pioneers in the middle of nowhere. He has his own life to worry about. And apparently that life doesn't include any room for the people who raised him and loved him and sacrificed for him. I replied, my voice steady despite the fury I was feeling. Thomas cleared his throat quietly. If I may, he said, I think this conversation has covered the legal essentials. The will is valid and the estate distribution is clear. If you choose to contest it, that's your right, but I'd strongly advise you to consult with qualified counsel before spending money on what would likely be an unsuccessful challenge. Marcus stood in the middle of my living room looking around at the home where he'd grown up, as if he were seeing it for the first time. For just a moment, I thought I saw something soften in his expression, some flicker of the boy who used to help me bake cookies on Sunday afternoons. But then Stephanie grabbed his arm. Come on, she said firmly. We're not getting anywhere here. Let's go home and figure out our options. Marcus allowed himself to be pulled toward the door, but he stopped and turned back to me one last time. You'll regret this, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. This ranch will fail without help, and you'll end up losing everything anyway. Maybe, I said quietly. But if it fails, it'll be because I wasn't strong enough to maintain what your father built, not because I sold it off to the highest bidder. Stephanie was already walking toward their car, talking rapidly on her phone to what I assumed was their lawyer in Dallas. Marcus picked up Andrew, who had been standing uncertainly near the toy box, looking confused and sad about leaving. As Marcus carried my grandson toward the door, Andrew looked back at me over his father's shoulder. Bye, Grandma, he said in his sweet little voice, and my heart broke all over again. I wanted to run after them to tell Andrew that he would always be welcome here, that there would always be toys in that wooden box and cookies in the kitchen and stories about his grandfather who had loved this land so much. But Marcus was already strapping him into his car seat, and Stephanie was still shouting into her phone about legal options and family rights. They drove away in a cloud of dust and anger, leaving me standing in my doorway with Thomas beside me. The silence that followed felt both peaceful and devastating. Are you all right, Jeanette? Thomas asked gently. I thought about his question for a moment, looking out at the pastures where Robert had spent so many happy hours, where Marcus had once played and learned and grown into someone I thought would carry on our family's legacy. You know what, Thomas? I said finally. I think I am all right. For the first time in 5 years, I think I actually am. Thomas nodded, understanding. Robert made the right decision, he said. He knew it would be painful, but he also knew that sometimes love means holding people accountable for their choices. After Thomas left, I walked through the house that now belonged entirely to me. I picked up the crumpled letter from Robert and smoothed it out, reading his words again in the quiet of our living room. Even from beyond the grave, my husband was still teaching our son important lessons about respect, responsibility, and the true meaning of family. I realized that Robert had given me more than just ownership of our ranch. He'd given me the freedom to decide whether Marcus would ever be welcomed back into our family and under what circumstances that might happen. It was a heavy responsibility, but it was also a gift of trust that I intended to honor. Standing in the doorway of the home Robert and I had shared for so many years, looking out at the land that had sustained 3 generations of his family, I understood that my real inheritance wasn't measured in acres or assets. It was the knowledge that love sometimes requires difficult choices, that respect can't be bought or demanded, and that the most valuable things in life are often the ones that can't be appraised or divided or sold. The sun was setting over the western pasture, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have taken Robert's breath away. And for the first time since his funeral, I felt a sense of peace settling over me like a warm blanket. Tomorrow, I'd start figuring out how to run this ranch on my own. Tomorrow, I'd begin the work of honoring Robert's legacy and deciding what kind of future I wanted to build on this land he'd loved so much. But tonight, I was just grateful to be home surrounded by memories of love that could never be taken away and values that would never go out of style. And somewhere in my heart, I held on to the hope that someday my grandson would come back to this place, not because he wanted to inherit something, but because he wanted to understand where he came from and what it really means to be part of a family that chooses love and respect over money and convenience. That would be the greatest inheritance of all. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had to make a difficult decision about family relationships? How do you balance love with accountability when someone you care about hurts you? Please share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like this video if my story touched your heart. Subscribe for more real-life stories about family forgiveness and finding strength in difficult times. And please share this video with anyone who might need to hear that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let people face the consequences of their choices. Wishing you all families filled with love, respect, and understanding. Take care, and I'll see you in the next story.